What's up, guys? So last video, Last Draken was able to guess the card art background, which was Ghost of Ramirez Di Pietro. If you can guess the card art background for this week, we'll feature your comment in the next one.
What's up, guys? Welcome to the Jank Divers, where we dive into the janky side of Commander. I'm Isaac.
And I'm Brent, and today we're going to be looking at Livio and Tana landscaping. So if you want to read the commanders on Isaac.
Sure. Livio, Oathsworn Sentinel. For 2 mana is a 2/2. You can pay 2 mana to choose another creature. Its controller may exile it with an Aegis counter on it. And then you can pay 3 mana and tap it to return all cards with Aegis counters from exile onto the battlefield under their owner's control. And our partner is going to be Tana the Bloodsower. So for 4 mana, it's a 2/2 with trample, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you get to create that many 1/1 green Saproling tokens. So the reason why we decided to use both of these commanders is we wanted to exile man lands. When we turn a land into a creature and then exile it with Livio, when we return it, it will be able to create like a landfall trigger. So that's sort of the idea of our deck, is to turn lands into creatures and then
Blink them.
blink them. Yeah, exactly.
So here we have some more cheaper activated man lands, which man land is slang for a land that we have turned into a creature. Mutavault, Mishras, and Blankmoth here all can become a creature for just 1 colorless mana, which is very useful. Then we got some more utility focused lands. So Field of the Dead, it enters taps for a colorless, and whenever it or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you have 7 or more lands with different names, make a 2/2 black zombie.
And creating and having 7 different lands with different names nowadays is super easy. You get to put in the snow basics just to create more easily tutorable ones, and just the sheer number of lands that we have available to us makes this pretty much just say, as long as you have 7 lands, you're creating zombies. So this is really good when we're trying to create a whole lot of lands in exile and bring them all back at once, as this lets us hold back an army in exile, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
Yeah, especially with all our random man lands that people won't normally run. Like, it's easy to get Field of the Dead online with just regular basic, snow basic Field of the Dead itself, and then 3 just random dual lands, but we have all these random man lands that make it even easier than it normally is. And next up, we have Valakut, and it enters tapped. And whenever a mountain enters the battlefield under your control, if you have at least 5 other mountains, you may have it deal 3 damage to any creature or player, and then it taps for a red. So this is a win condition.
Yeah, it's also, you may look at it and think, oh, but you only have a few number of mountains, but we do have some ways to turn our actual mountains into creatures and exile them. So we can kind of loop Valakut as removal or just some lightning bolts to the face by just turning mountains, exiling them, and returning them. And we also have some interesting other tricks that we have with Valakut that we'll explain later on. I just wanted to make note that this is more triggers than it appears to be.
Next up we have Dryad Arbor, which is nice because it is a man land that we do not have to pay to make it a creature, so it just comes out as a creature, really efficient, especially when we want to be exiling things with Livio. It can get kind of mana intensive when you have to pay large amounts of mana to either use other cards to turn your lands into creatures or just activate all your different 1 or 2 mana man lands. Having one that just does it out of the box is really convenient. Next up, we got some Planeswalkers, and if you notice, all these Planeswalkers have a +1 that turns a land into a creature, which is again, manaless way to do that, and they're also repeatable. And they also have other abilities. So first up will be Nissa, who shakes the world.
Or Nissa, who breaks the standard.
Yeah, exactly. So for 3 and double green, a 5 loyalty, whenever you tap a forest, you add additional green, and then +1, you put 3 counters on a target non-creature land, then you untap it, and it becomes a land with vigilance and haste. So not only can you make haste creatures, you can put a land down, especially if it's like a forest, tap it for 2 green, then plus it, tap it for 2 green again. So you can make a lot of mana with this, and you're animating your lands, which is always nice. And then we got the ultimate for -8. You get an emblem. Lands you control have indestructible. Search your library for any number of forest cards, put them onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. Notice it doesn't say basic forest, so a lot of our dual lands can be searched out this way. And we run a lot of cards that we won't talk about in the video that specifically call out forest, and you can get your dual lands that way as well.
Also, the lands you control have indestructible. If you can manage to get this emblem, that is super strong in this deck, just since we have so many man lands and ways to turn lands into creatures. Having an army of indestructible creatures is obviously very, very powerful, because whenever anybody tries to play a board wipe, as long as it's not an exile board wipe, you're going to be the only one left with creatures, which makes it really easy to attack.
Yeah, exactly. Next up we got Koth of the Hammer for 2 and a double red for 3 loyalty. You can +1, untap target mountain. It becomes a 4/4 red elemental until end of turn, and it's still a land. Then -2, you can add a red for each mountain you control. And then -5, you get an emblem with mountains you control have tap. This land deals 1 damage to target creature or player. So again, they don't say basic, so we've got a good amount of mountains in this deck. And coming up later, we have some ways to turn all of our lands into mountains. So plenty of ways to take advantage of this. And then finally, Nissa Vital Force for also 3 and 2 green, 5 loyalty, +1, untap a land you control until your next turn. It becomes a 5/5 with haste. That's still a land, so really big, and has haste, so you can use it on lands you just put down. Again, the untapping shenanigans to make double the mana. Then the -3, which is the reason most people will play this card, which returns target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. Target permanent is a really good thing to be able to get back, because it can get back cards that are usually hard to return, like a Planeswalker, but it's also just good value even if you're just getting back a creature or a land or something. And then -6, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. We're going to have a lot of lands enter the battlefield, so ideally we'll draw a lot of cards. So
and it does say may, so it's not like you're going to drown yourself out or accidentally mill yourself. If you mill yourself with that emblem, it is going to be on purpose. It's also one of the most relevant emblems because you can literally play it the next turn if you need the card draw. Just +1 her, then she's at 6, -6 her that turn, and get the emblem. So it's not like it's ridiculously hard to get that emblem out with Nissa. You just have to be able to protect her for 1 turn, which is a lot easier than protecting her for 3 turns or for 4 turns even with the other Nissa.
Yeah, really flexible card, does a lot.
We also have some very powerful effects with Landfall. Since we're holding back all those man lands in exile and we're saving them up for 1 massive Landfall dump, we wanted to have some really powerful Landfall effects. Morog, Fury of Akum? How would you pronounce that, Brent?
I'd say Akum.
Akum, okay. For 6 mana is a 6/6, and each creature you control gets +1/+0 for each time it has attacked this turn, which with Tana, it is really good since she creates a whole lot of tokens. It is a little anthem effect for it. And the landfall effect is whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if it's your main phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase. At the beginning of that combat, untap all creatures you control. So if you save up even like 4 or 5 different man lands and play them all at once, you'll get to attack 5 times that combat. 5 or 6 times that combat, which really adds up with that first ability. If they can't block even 1 Saproling, that's going to deal a ton of damage with just 1 Saproling. Oban, Moldiah Ancestor, for 4 mana, is a 3/3, and this card is probably just one of the most perfect cards in our deck. It's just the perfect fit. because with either of our commanders, it's helping us with the strategy we want to be using for it. So at the beginning of combat on your turn, up to one target land you control becomes an XX elemental creature token, or elemental creature with trample and haste until end of turn, where X is Ovun's power. It's still a land. So you're turning a land into a creature, which is perfect for trying to exile them with Aegis counters on them. And the Landfall ability is whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, which is perfect for Tana since she wants to have a higher power to be able to deal more damage, to be able to create more Saprolings.
Saproling gang.
Saproling gang, that's right. So it's just the perfect fit in our deck. And then Skyclave Pickaxe. For 1 mana, when it enters the battlefield, you get to attach it to target creature you control, which again will probably be Tana. And Landfall, when a land enters the battlefield under your control, equipped creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So again, let's just say you've exiled 4 man lands and you return them all. That's +8/+8. So an already 2/2. If they can't block that, you're going to create 10 Saprolings just right there from just one Skyclave Pickaxe. And that's not even counting your land for turn or any other landfall effects you may have. Having 1 or 2 of any of these landfall cards is going to make every land in exile really count.
Next up, we have some additional landfall win conditions. First up is going to be the Spitfire Lagak, who could be included by his name alone, but luckily he also has a good card attached to him. So for 3 and a red, a 3/4 lizard, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, he does 1 damage to each opponent. Now, this might look like an unassuming, just kind of
draft card.
Common. Yeah. I remember playing this at the pre-release and laughing about the name, but here it is in a commander deck, because when you can drop in honestly, even just 5 lands, 5 damage isn't terrible. And then that's the low end for this deck.
That is the low end. We can really get some lands going, given enough turns. It's not terribly out of the question to get upper teens, like 15, 16 different lands triggers in 1 turn, which is a substantial amount of damage with Spitfire Lagak.
Yeah, exactly. And it says each opponent too, so you don't even have to single somebody out. You can just kind of clean the table out. And it's a creature, so it's just a static effect, and even if somebody tries to kill it, you can rescue it by exiling it with Livio if you have the mana up or whatever. So it's a very powerful card that doesn't really look like it at first glance. Next up, we got Felidar Retreat for 3 and a white, an enchantment with Landfall, and you choose one whenever you proc Landfall, which will either be to create a 2/2 white cat beast creature, or to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain vigilance until end of turn.
Again, another great way to buff up Tana and all the other Saprolings that she's been creating at the same time, mind you.
Mm-hmm.
So lets you just really build an impressive, massive board. Or just flood the board with 2/2s if you need to go wide for whatever reason. We also have Valakut Exploration for 3 mana. It has Landfall. Exile the top card of your library. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. It doubles as a sort of card draw engine. You can only play that card the turn that you play the land, but if you don't play that card at the beginning of your end step, all cards that are exiled with Valakut Exploration gets put into their owner's graveyard, and then Valakut Exploration deals that much damage to each opponent. Again, if you play 4 or 5 different lands in 1 turn, you're gonna get to draw basically 4 or 5 cards. Any cards that you don't play from those cards will just get translated right into damage. So if you have Spitfire Lagak and Valakut Exploration,
You're just dropping nukes.
yeah, you're dropping nukes at that point. Each land's dealing 2 damage. And that's not even, the ridiculous part about it. With these next cards, you can see that we can really get a lot of landfall triggers from these cards here.
I put in the wrong green warded.
That's the wrong green warded. All right. 2 minutes, guys.
Sorry about that. Got the right Green Warden in there this time. My bad. Can you blame me though? They look almost the same. Let's be real.
So, with these cards, we're able to reach the upper limits of our landfall triggers. Dryad of the Illicit Grove lets us play an additional land on each of our turns, so it does help with the landfall triggers ability a little bit. We're mostly playing it for the second ability, which lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types.
Like calling back to Koth, for example.
Yeah, so Koth's emblem would be
Or his
really good,
-2.
or even his -2 to ramp a whole ton, right? Or back to Valakut if you want to go that far back. It turns all of our lands into lightning bolts as well.
Mm-hmm.
Or even Nissa who breaks standard.
Yeah.
All of our lands now produce an additional green.
Yeah. There's a 4th Nissa in the deck list that untaps forests. So.
Mm-hmm. So it just all around really helps with a lot of our cards and synergies. It's just a really great card to include here, I think. But these other 2 cards are really going to help us with getting our landfall triggers really high. So Ashea, Soul of the Wild, for 5 mana, is a star with power and toughness equal to the number of lands you control. And non-token creatures you control are forest lands in addition to their other types. So she herself does count as a land, so she does proc landfall triggers.
Any creatures we play will count as a landfall then?
Mm-hmm. Any creatures that we play will count as a landfall. And another thing is, with Livio, we can start exiling creatures, even Ashea herself, bring them all back. All of them are going to enter as lands, and that's going to help us create even more landfall tokens or landfall triggers. And then Ancient Green Warden, for 6 mana is a 5/7 with reach. You can play lands from your graveyard, useful if you're playing fetches or even just losing a land from any sort of land removal or milling that your opponents might do to you.
If you had to discard the hand size somehow. It's just a randomly good ability, but it's not why we included it. We like the second part.
We do like the second part. If a land entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So this doubles all of our landfall effects. So we've been going off of just 4 or 5 man lands. That'll double it to 8 to 10 landfall triggers from just 4 to 5 lands, which is a pretty reasonable thing. But it gets really crazy where if you have like any 2 of these cards here, especially Ashea and Ancient Green Warden, if you have both of those out there,
it gets crazy.
Then you get a ridiculous amount of landfall triggers. Which, as you've seen, can get very powerful. So these are how we're getting to, the upper teens or maybe even 20 landfall triggers in one turn. Absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, like Ancient Green Warden, you just need 10 lands. Like, it sounds crazy, but it's really not, honestly.
No, really not.
Next up, we got some cards that go particularly well with Ashea and are just good in general. So first we got Planar Outburst, so 3 and double white, destroy all non-land creatures. So people that aren't this deck typically don't have land creatures, so it's a pretty decent board wipe on its own. It does have Awaken 4, which means instead of paying it for 5, you can pay it for 5 and triple white, and then if you do, you put 4 counters on a land you control, and it becomes a elemental with haste. So it animates a land for us, which isn't bad. We like doing that. It's a decent board wipe, but when combined with Ashea, which makes all of our regular creatures lands as well, it becomes a one-sided board wipe, which is really good for obvious reasons.
Especially when our commander procs off of dealing damage to another player. If they don't have any blockers, and we can just animate any man lands that we have and haven't exiled yet and just swing in, lets us get in a lot of damage unsuspectingly. And Terra Eternal, for 3 mana, all lands are indestructible. We're not really blowing up our opponent's lands at all in this deck, so making our lands indestructible is very important to us, since we have a lot of man lands. We're turning a lot of creatures into lands, and we have Ashea, which makes all of our creatures into lands, basically. All of our non-token creatures anyway. So having all of our non-token creatures be indestructible, it's a pretty good combo. Yeah. Pretty good combo. Lets any board wipe be a one-sided board wipe, basically, even ones that our opponents will play.
Also just makes just randomly animating a land safer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like you got a +1 your Nissa or something, like you can just do it without fear of it getting destroyed.
We even have some really high target lands in our deck, like Valakut and Field of the Dead. Having those be indestructible and having them be protected from like Field of Ruin or Ghost Quarters or something along those lines, it's very good.
Yeah.
Very good protection for those powerful lands.
Next up, we got some Saproling Tribal, as Tana will create a lot of Saprolings, so it was kind of worth it to just include some random Saproling Tribal. It's also fun. You know, the Saproling Tribal cards are just cool.
Yeah, we have a lot of other ways to buff up Tana. If you're interested in seeing the whole deck list, we will put that in the description, so go ahead and check that out. But yeah, we just felt like it was important to include some of the best of the Saproling Tribal cards.
Yeah, so first up will be Utopia Mycon, which is a 1 green for a 0/2 fungus. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you put a spore counter on it. And then you can remove 3 spore counters to create a Saproling. So it does kind of work by itself. It's not really that great by itself, but it's better than nothing. And then you can sacrifice a Saproling to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, which gets crazy when our commander is creating like even on the low end, just like 4 or 5 Saprolings. If you hit, then that's a lot of ramp.
That's really a lot of ramp for 1 mana.
Yeah. And next up, I got a Psychotrope Thallid, which has the same put a spore counter on it at the start of your turn, and then remove 3 to make a Saproling. And then you can pay 1 and sacrifice a Saproling to draw a card. Drawing cards is something that, you know, non-blue can kind of struggle with sometimes, so having more interesting ways to repeatedly draw a lot is going to be good in a deck like this. Then we got Fungal Plots for 1 and a green and Enchantment. You can pay 1 and a green to exile a creature card from your graveyard and create a 1/1 Saproling. And then you can sacrifice 2 of those Saprolings to gain 2 life and draw a card. So this draws cards without even needing mana, which, you know, the deck can get kind of mana intensive with trying to exile everything with Livio. So being able to just draw a card without having to pay anything is always nice. And you get a bit of life gain, not bad.
It's also really nice if somebody is trying to wipe the board, which in your aggressive style decks like this one, people will be trying to play board wipes a lot. So if you don't have any sort of way to protect yourself against a board wipe, then being able to sacrifice a lot of your board into card draw will help you rebuild a lot faster. So being able to sacrifice without paying mana is very, very useful. These are some more Saproling stuff that we included. We didn't include a whole lot of Saproling stuff. This is about all of it. We just thought that they were powerful enough to include Life and Limb for 4 mana is an enchantment. All forests and all Saprolings are 1/1 green Saproling creatures and forest lands in addition to their other types. So this is that card that we were missing and wanting so bad that turns our Saprolings into lands. Whenever Tana is going to deal damage to a player, it's going to create that many lands this time and create a lot more landfall triggers, which isn't useful in a handful of scenarios, but is very useful in some other scenarios. And it's just another way to turn our regular forests into creatures, to exile them with Livio for more landfall triggers from our exile. Night Soil is our graveyard removal we chose, mostly because it's on theme. So for 2 mana, it's an enchantment, and you can pay 1 mana and exile 2 creature cards from a single graveyard. and put a 1/1 green Saproling creature token onto the battlefield. So since we have some of that Saproling tribal stuff, we decided to use this as our graveyard hate, just to try to proc some of those Saproling tribal cards a little more often.
Yeah, it's also a repeatable effect, which isn't always too common with graveyard hate. Like some people will just play Night Soil, like just because, like even without the Saproling component.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like a non-creature version of Scavenging Ooze.
Yeah. So next up we have Spore Mound, which will be 3 and double green, and it's a 3/3 fungus. And whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 Saproling onto the battlefield. Obviously, we can make a lot of Saprolings with this because we'll be having a lot of landfalls enter. And I just really like this card. This is one of the first cards I played with, so I have a bit of an attachment to it. But I do think it's good here. We like, it makes Saproling, so it helps with the Saproling component, but it's also not completely useless by itself. Again, you have life and limb out. It's creating lands. Like, that's crazy.
Actually goes infinite.
Oh, it goes infinite. I didn't even notice that.
I didn't even notice that till like we were building the slideshow, and I didn't even notice this.
Yeah.
But it goes infinite with life in the limb.
I did not see that. Yeah. Never mind.
Yeah. So you probably want like some sort of, you'd have to hold back a card in your hand to turn that combo off, like Swords to Plowshares or something to try to turn this off. But
oh yeah, you can't stop it.
no, you can't stop that combo. So I guess you have to be a little bit careful when you have those two cards in particular. But if you do have just like a Swords or a Nature's Claim or something, you could just create as many Saprolings as you want, which is pretty cool, especially if you have like a way to turn it into mana or card draw or something.
Yeah, the amount of unintentional infinite combos we get into these decks is kind of funny. It's happened a few times.
It has happened more often than I care to admit.
So next up, we're gonna have some equipment to buff up our Tana. As you know, the bigger she is, the more Saprolings we get. So first we have Stoneforge Mystic for 1 and a white. It's a 1/2 core artificer. And when it enters the battlefield, you can search your library for an equipment, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Shuffle your library. Then you can pay 1 and a white to tap it to put an equipment from your hand onto the battlefield. So this is an enter the battlefield trigger, which means we can get a lot of equipments with Livio if we need to. So an interesting card advantage engine, aside from it just being, really good just by itself. Then we got Sword of Feast and Famine for 3 colorless artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from black and from green, so helps our Tana get in through blockers. A lot of people have green or black creatures, so being able to be unblocked by them is nice. And just blanking removal such as Assassin's Trophy or Maelstrom Pulse, also pretty good. And then whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card and you untap all your lands in an equipped 2. So obviously untapping all our lands is exceptionally powerful in a landfall deck when we're going to have a lot of lands.
And we're spending a lot of mana trying to animate man lands and exile lands with Livio, and on top of that playing all of our spells and our 5-drops, a lot of 5-drops, Planeswalkers and powerful spells and stuff. So we're spending a lot of mana in this deck. So being able to have tutorable mana ramp and a lot of ramp is very important in this deck. So having Stoneforge Mystic is just kind of like a catch-all. It can find us card draw, it can find us land ramp, it can find us just a way to buff up Tanya a lot with like Skyclave Pickaxe or any of that fun stuff. Or even a pair of boots if you just want hexproof. You can even find something like that. There's just so many good options for Stoneforge Mystic. Obviously the deck would work without it if you were just trying to like make big budget cuts. There's a lot of budget cuts you can make in this deck for sure, but Stoneforge Mystic is obviously very, very powerful. And it's not even You could even go more ham on the Stoneforge Mystic plan if you wanted to change the deck a little bit and do like the classic Batter Skull. Because giving like Spitfire Legek like lifelink,
oh, that's pretty funny.
That would be pretty cool too.
Yeah. I doubt Sword and Fire Vice would be bad either. But we're not running that.
Anyway, there are options for this deck too. But I just wanted to point out some stuff that Stoneforge Mystic does do in our deck and does do well, and what she could do in our deck. Yeah.
Then lastly, we got Skull Clamp for 1 artifact. You've seen it before. Equipped creature gets +1/-1. And whenever the equipped creature dies, you draw 2 cards. Obviously, we're making a lot of 1/1 Saprolings, so being able to draw cards off of them is really powerful, especially when we can tutor up the Skull Clamp. That's going to be it for the landscaping deck. Again, we got the deck list in the description if you want to see the full thing. And if you want to have your comment featured in the next video, you can try and guess the art in the background. But yeah, anyway, if you enjoyed the video, just be sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment, all that good stuff.
And hit that notification bell.
Yeah, do that. And we'll see you next week.